It started like any other quiet Sunday morning in West Africa. An old man in Lagos stepped out onto his small balcony to water the plants his wife left behind. The city was just waking up. Distant church bells, a few car horns, children's voices in the street below. And then he heard it, that deep, familiar roar of fighter jets tearing through the sky. He froze. For a moment his heart leaped with hope. Maybe he thought they've finally gone after the terrorists who've been burning our villages. Maybe they're protecting our own people at last. But as the news trickled in through WhatsApp messages and radio whispers, reality hit like a cold wave. Those jets were not heading toward the terrorist camps inside Nigeria. They were crossing the border into Benin, a small neighbor many Americans have never heard of, to strike at a group of soldiers involved in an attempted coup. And behind that decision, people were already whispering another name, France. So tonight I want to ask you, especially if you remember the Cold War, Vietnam, Angola, or all the small places that suddenly mattered on the evening news, why did Nigeria move so fast to protect one president next door, while moving so slowly to protect its own people at home, who really benefits when African jets fly at dawn, ordinary families, or distant capitals in Europe? And how many times have we seen this pattern before, where a local crisis becomes the chessboard for someone else's game? In this video, we'll walk hour by hour through what happened in Benin, how Nigeria got involved, and why the shadow of old empires, especially Paris, still hangs over West Africa today. If you believe that understanding the truth behind these events matters more than headlines or slogans, I invite you to stay with me. And if you're one of those people who still cares about what happens to ordinary families on the ground, in Benin, in Nigeria, and across Africa, then listen closely. What you're about to hear will sound strangely familiar. In the hours before dawn on December 7th, while most families in Benin were still asleep, something unusual was unfolding on the quiet streets of Cotonou. The city, normally calm on a Sunday morning, carried a strange stillness, one that older Americans might remember from the morning of unexpected news, the kind that changes a country before breakfast. To understand what happened that morning, we need to look at the pressure that had been building inside Benin long before a single shot was fired. Benin is often described as one of West Africa's stable democracies, a phrase repeated in newspapers and policy documents in Washington and Brussels. But stability can be deceptive. Since 2016, President Patrice Talon had governed with a firm grip, praised for economic reforms, yes, but criticized for tightening political space, favoring loyalists, and projecting the quiet confidence of a leader who believes the system will always bend in his direction. In 2024, a small plot against him was uncovered. Two officials close to him were arrested, and by January 2025, both men had been sentenced to 20 years in prison. Tensions didn't disappear after that, they simply went underground. And with elections scheduled for April 2026, the air in Benin was thick with the sense that something was coming. Ordinary citizens felt it. Soldiers felt it even more. At around 5 to 6 a.m. on December 7th, a convoy of soldiers led by a mid-ranking officer, Lieutenant Colonel Tigri, moved toward the presidential residence. Their boots struck the pavement in sharp, disciplined rhythm. Some residents later said the sound reminded them of thunderstorms rolling across the coastline, distant at first, then suddenly overwhelming. These soldiers identified themselves as the Military Committee for Refoundation, a name meant to signal rebirth, an attempt to convince the public that they were acting not for power, but for national rescue. As they approached the residence, they radioed out coded messages, while guards loyal to the government scrambled to respond. No one knew how wide the operation was or whether more barracks would join them. Like many coups throughout Africa's modern history, this one did not emerge from pure ambition. The soldiers had a list of grievances they believed the government had ignored for too long. They accused the Talon administration of mismanaging the military, diverting resources, while soldiers fought and died with inadequate support. They complained about unmerited promotions, saying rank was awarded based on political loyalty, not competence. They said the government had abandoned the families of fallen soldiers, leaving widows and children to fend for themselves. They warned that jihadist violence in northern Benin was rising and that authorities were slow, sometimes unwilling to protect civilians. They spoke about cuts to military health care and benefits even as taxes were raised on ordinary citizens. And they claimed that the government suppressed free speech and opposition voices, turning democracy into a polished facade. For many older Americans listening to this, it might sound familiar patterns seen in countries where pressure builds silently until someone finally breaks the door. By 7 a.m., the coup plotters had moved beyond the presidential residence and taken control of the national broadcaster ORTB. Television screens across Benin flickered, went dark for a moment, and then showed uniformed soldiers reading a terse announcement: the president had been removed. The constitution and parliament were dissolved. A transitional military government was in place. Lieutenant Colonel Tigri was now head of state. For a brief window, perhaps 2 hours, it seemed the coup had succeeded. People called their relatives. Some hid indoors. Others gathered in small crowds whispering about what would happen to their jobs, their children, their future. But at 11:09 a.m., everything shifted again. The interior minister appeared on television, not the rebel station but the official one, calmly declaring that this was nothing more than a mutiny by a small group. Loyalist forces had already begun surrounding rebel positions. Government troops moved swiftly, reclaiming the broadcaster and pushing back the soldiers who had seized it. By early afternoon, the administration announced that President Talon was safe, the coup had failed, and the main perpetrators had been arrested. Reports said that 13 to 17 soldiers were in custody, including several individuals believed to be foreign nationals from Burkina Faso. The sun had not yet reached its peak, and yet Benin had lived through more political chaos in 6 hours than some nations experience in a decade. When news of the failed coup reached regional capitals, the atmosphere across West Africa changed almost instantly. In places like Abuja, Accra, and Dakar, officials who had been enjoying a quiet Sunday suddenly found themselves on phone calls, in emergency briefings, and in rooms where voices were low, but urgency was unmistakable. For people who lived through the Cold War, this moment would feel familiar, the way a local event can echo through entire regions before the dust even settles. By noon, ECOWAS, the regional bloc of West African nations, released a strong statement condemning the coup attempt. In the past few years, the bloc had suffered blow after blow. Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, all had seen their governments fall to military takeovers. Benin, in the eyes of many diplomats, was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be the safe one. And so, ECOWAS activated its regional standby force, a mechanism designed for moments exactly like this, moments when democracy in one country risks pulling down the stability of several others. The message was clear: another domino must not fall. Inside Nigeria, generals reviewed maps and lists of available squadrons. Ghana placed troops on standby. Even countries farther away signaled readiness. The air in ECOWAS headquarters felt tense, as though everyone knew how close the region had come to another earthquake. While all this was happening externally inside Benin, the government was sending urgent diplomatic messages. The most important of these was a note verbale sent to Abuja, an official but quietly desperate request for help. A note verbale is not a press conference. It is not a public plea. It is the kind of message a government sends only when time is short, danger is near, and survival depends on the speed of a neighbor's response. For older Americans, imagine a letter sent during the early hours of the Cuban Missile Crisis, formal, tense, and written with the knowledge that the next move might determine whether peace holds or collapses. When Nigeria received that request, everything accelerated. Tong Thong, Nigeria, Fe Duyet, Jio Jong, Kong, Kwan, Nigeria, Naf Tien Thang, Vao Kong, Fan Benin. Fighter jets climbed into the sky, their engines cracking open the morning air over Lagos, Abeokuta, and Ogun State before crossing the border. Witnesses in Cotonou later described the sound as something they felt in their bones. Some thought it was thunder, others feared it was the start of a foreign invasion. A few simply prayed. The Nigerian jets carried out precision strikes on 2 locations: Mot Tre Lin Noin Hom Jao Chin, George Chola Lapke Hoach. Jai Truyen Hin Kwak, Gia Noi Mot So Bin Si Van Kotu, So Kifat Tuyen Bo Jao Chin. Every explosion sent shockwaves through the city, not just physical ones, but emotional ones. Families huddled together. Elders recalled old stories of coups in the 1970s and 1980s. Children cried, asking whether a war had started. Amid the confusion, residents reported seeing French helicopters in Benin's air corridor. Whether the reports were accurate or not, the symbolism was enough to ignite debate. For many West Africans, French military aircraft flying overhead carried decades of meaning: colonial rule, intervention, resource control, and the long arm of a country that once dictated borders, leaders, and political outcomes. Even unverified, the sightings added a new layer of tension. Was Nigeria acting alone, or had France been pulling strings from behind the curtain? By afternoon, Nigerian television stations were filled with commentators reacting to the day's events. Some spoke with pride, calling it a defining moment, evidence that Nigeria still had the strength to defend democracy in West Africa. One commentator compared it to America's actions in Grenada in 1983, swift, decisive, justified. But others were uneasy. A constitutional expert on Arise TV raised a troubling point. Under Nigerian law, the president cannot simply deploy military force beyond the country's borders without authorization from the National Assembly. If he does, it could, at least in theory, be grounds for impeachment. His voice was steady, not dramatic. But the weight of his words hung in the air. As the afternoon wore on, analysts began discussing the most dangerous scenario of all. What if a counter-coup succeeded in Benin days or weeks later? What if a new military government took power and declared that Nigeria's airstrikes amounted to an act of war? A single decision made before noon in Abuja could ignite a conflict no one asked for and no one was prepared to fight. For many older viewers, the pattern felt painfully familiar. One country intervenes for stability, another interprets it as aggression, and the fire spreads before anyone can put it out. As the sun began to set over Cotonou that evening, the political crisis of the morning had already begun, transforming into something deeper, something that touched not only government buildings and military barracks, but kitchens, living rooms, and street corners where ordinary families gathered to make sense of what had happened. In many neighborhoods, parents kept their children inside long after the fighting had stopped. The air still smelled faintly of smoke from the morning blasts. Elderly women whispered prayers as they lit candles. Young men stood in clusters, unsure whether to feel relief or anger. People were not simply afraid of the coup itself, they were afraid of what might follow. Fear of revenge operations, fear of further attacks, fear that the military, embarrassed by a failed uprising, would tighten its grip on the streets. A grandmother in the district of Fidrosa told reporters, "I lived through the old coups. I know what comes next." It is never finished in one day. Her words captured the emotional landscape perfectly. Even in a failed coup, the psychological aftershocks linger for weeks, sometimes months. As the markets reopened, people noticed immediate changes. Some traders refused to open their stalls, worried looting could break out if political tensions rose again. Taxi drivers turned down fares that required crossing military checkpoints. Fishermen along the coastline said they would avoid going out at night for fear of sudden patrols or mistaken identity. Even the currency markets reacted. The CFA franc, tied to France and used across much of West Africa, wavered slightly as rumors spread about France's possible involvement. For ordinary families, that meant small but painful shifts in prices for imported goods, medicine, grain, motor oil. Uncertainty more than bullets became the real threat to daily life. Although President Talon had survived the coup, the event left his administration with a deep and visible bruise. People began asking difficult questions. How did a group of mid-ranking soldiers get so close to the presidential residence? Why were their grievances never addressed until they became gunfire? If the military is this divided, what will happen during the 2026 elections? Even among Talon's supporters, some quietly admitted that the coup had exposed cracks the government could no longer ignore. A stable democracy, as diplomats like to describe Benin, should not crumble so easily at dawn. Neighbors watched closely. In Togo, analysts went on radio urging their government to strengthen oversight of the armed forces. In Ghana, lawmakers warned that instability from one border can seep into the next like water through a cracked wall. In Nigeria, the reaction was more complicated. Many Nigerians applauded their country's rapid intervention, but just as many questioned the wisdom of it. If Benin's political system remains unstable, Nigeria might find itself permanently entangled in a crisis that is not its own. And for a nation already battling terrorists, bandits, and economic hardship, this was a burden many felt Nigeria could not afford. By the night of December 7th, one thing had become clear: the failed coup in Benin was not an isolated event. It was a spark landing on dry grass, a region already tense from the rise of the Sahel military alliances, the collapse of French influence, and the growing struggle for security sovereignty. If Benin falters, the ripple could spread across the Gulf of Guinea, threatening shipping lanes, energy projects, and the fragile sense of normalcy that millions depend on. For older Americans, it echoed a pattern they had seen before. In Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America, instability rarely stops at one border. From Washington's perspective, the failed coup in Benin may have looked at first like just another episode of political turbulence in a distant corner of the world. But as analysts dug deeper and the details of Nigeria's airstrikes became public, a more familiar and unsettling picture began to emerge, one that echoed the geopolitical patterns many older Americans remember vividly. For decades, West Africa has been a region where influence was predictable. France held economic and military sway over its former colonies, and the United States kept a cautious but respectful distance, watching from afar while prioritizing trade, counterterrorism, and diplomatic stability. But in the past few years, the region has started to drift away from Paris, and Washington is still trying to understand what that means. When a coup happens in a French-speaking country, the reflex used to be simple: Paris steps in, Europe follows, and the U.S. offers diplomatic support. This time, however, something different happened. Nigeria, not France, launched the decisive military action. Benin, a country aligned with Paris for years, asked Abuja, not Paris, for emergency help. And across the Sahel, nations like Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, have openly rejected Western military influence. To American strategists, this is the kind of shift that can reshape an entire continent. In the Cold War era, the U.S. learned a painful lesson: when a region loses clear alliances, it doesn't remain neutral, it becomes a battleground for competing powers. Today, West Africa is slipping into that uncertain zone. France's influence is weakening. Russia is gaining footholds through private military contracts. China is expanding economic ties. And now Nigeria is stepping into a leadership role that Washington does not fully understand. For older Americans, this resembles the early 1960s: shifting loyalties, uncertain transitions, and small nations caught between global agendas. The U.S. is unlikely to intervene directly in Benin, but Washington cannot ignore three key concerns. Terror groups in the Sahel are expanding southward toward the Gulf of Guinea. Shipping lanes near Benin are critical to global trade, including U.S. energy interests. A wider conflict between Benin and Nigeria could destabilize one of Africa's largest populations and economies. Quietly, U.S. diplomats are already asking questions. Why did Nigeria act so quickly? Was France involved behind the scenes? And most importantly, how will Burkina Faso's anti-French stance under Ibrahim Traoré reshape the next chapters of regional stability? Across Europe, officials privately worry that the collapse of French influence leaves a vacuum too large for the EU to manage. In Russia and China, analysts see opportunity. In African capitals, leaders are asking whether a new security architecture, one free from old colonial power, might finally be possible. And in the United States, older observers may feel a quiet déjà vu, the sense that a distant region is becoming strategically important, not because of ideology, but because instability has a way of traveling by sea lanes, migration routes, and economic shockwaves. As night fell across West Africa, the streets of Cotonou slowly returned to an uneasy calm. Shops reopened. Children ventured outside again. The smoke from the morning explosions faded into the evening breeze, but beneath that surface calm, a deeper truth lingered, one that cannot be erased by a presidential announcement or a military press briefing. What happened in Benin was more than a failed coup. It was a warning, a reminder that stability is fragile, that alliances can shift overnight, that decisions made in distant capitals, Paris, Abuja, even Washington, can shape the fate of millions who never get a chance to vote on them. And perhaps most importantly, it exposed a simple but uncomfortable reality: West Africa is entering a new era, one where old powers no longer dictate outcomes and new powers have not yet proven their vision. For Americans who lived through Vietnam, Lebanon, or the long shadow of the Cold War, this moment may feel hauntingly familiar. You know better than most how quickly a regional issue can become a global concern, how small sparks, when ignored, can ignite large fires. In the weeks ahead, Benin will struggle to rebuild trust inside its military. Nigeria will face questions about the legality and wisdom of its intervention. France will try to reposition itself as a stabilizing force, even as its credibility in the region crumbles. And terror groups will watch closely, searching for cracks in the region's security architecture. If a counter-coup emerges, and history tells us that defeated factions rarely disappear quietly, the entire Gulf of Guinea could be pulled into a crisis far bigger than anything seen on December 7th. 7th. At the same time, other African nations are charting a different path. Across the Sahel, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are rejecting outside control and calling for a new model of security, one built on sovereignty, local strength, and regional solidarity. And whether you agree with him or not, there is no denying one thing: he has forced the world to rethink Africa's place in global affairs. This is why many people now follow Africa news more closely than ever before. Because the story unfolding across West Africa is not just about governments, it is about the future of an entire continent and the choices that will define whether its people stand free or remain beholden to foreign powers. So I want to ask you, especially those of you who've seen history repeat itself more times than you can count, do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's push for national sovereignty is the right direction for Africa? Or do you think another leader should rise to continue what he started? And should countries like Benin and Nigeria keep relying on old alliances or finally choose their own path forward? Please share your thoughts. Your perspective matters more than you know. If you feel you're among the first to truly follow and support President Ibrahim Traoré beyond the headlines, please share this video. And subscribe if you believe that truth, real truth, is still worth searching for in a world full of noise.